Humvee watch, secret codes in space watches, elusive Montgomery Burns-esque Norwegian billionaires running a supposedly all-American company. Timex Sinclair is a thing. Stay tuned if you care to join me on a swift triathlon through 70s, 80s and 90s Timex digital watches, sandwiched like a layer of electrically excited zinc sulfide between an expedition into broader Timex history and an attempt to at least understand the current setup. Welcome to the Illuminating Watches channel, where we seek to shed light on often neglected areas of watchdom. The focus this week, Timex, with a particular focus on their digital catalogue and history. I'm trying a different strategy this week to see if I can get you to subscribe. It's very subtle and will come in later. But whilst you wait for that exciting prospect, let's talk about Waterbury, Connecticut, with the Timex brand having its origins in the thriving brass industry there in the 1800s. With the establishment of Waterbury clocks in 1857, which could leverage the brass made in the factory in cases and movements which until then they'd been selling on to other clock companies. They would become intertwined with the history of Ingersoll watches and classic milestones in horological history like the Yankee Dollar watch and of course the deal with Disney to create some of the first licensed Mickey Mouse watches. After being bought out by the Norwegian shipping businessmen Joachim Lemkul and Thomas Olsen fleeing the Nazi invasion of Norway, they would get into the defence business with fuse timers and technology such as Armalloy, a hard alloy that could replace jewels as hard-wearing bearings in watches, saving enormous amounts of cost and adding durability so watches could take a licking and keep on ticking at an affordable price. An important recipe for the brand, as well as it must be said the ugliest and most hated mechanical movements by watchmakers and dealers, perhaps the dark side of the aforementioned recipe. Leaning into the opportunity to position themselves as a United States brand from the defence work, the company would rename to the United States Time Corporation, which from the research for this video is kind of funny, as although the headquarters is still very much in Middlebury, Connecticut, the Fred Olsen company that largely owns the Timex group, the relatives of the previously mentioned Thomas Olsen, is still very much Norwegian, who has previously been described as a potential inspiration for the character Mr. Burns before Matt Groening ruled out this fact. I'll come back to them at the end of the video. After an initial run out on some nurse watches in 1949, and I couldn't help but include this picture of the nurse's watch the midwife was wearing when my daughter was born a month ago, the Timex brand we know today would start to be used in the early 50s in brands like the Marquette and Monroe, but more famously in the well-known Marlin brand, a brand that, like me, has strong connections with Great Britain, having been made at a factory here in Dundee, Scotland for over 40 years, before being shut down in a major labour dispute in 1993, which is excellently documented in the BBC Scotland documentary I've listed on screen. Now, Timex had the chance to beat Hamilton and the Ventura into the era of electric watches, as it actually acquired the West German Larco Duro in 1959, the innovators behind the Electromat, one of the earliest electric movements. But to save costs in line with their mission to be affordable, they stopped the project, only to rejoin the fray later on in 1961 or 62 with the M67. They do redeem themselves slightly as innovators, as being the creators of the world's first commercially viable electric ladies' watch with the M82, which nicely links us into the very madman-esque advertising they were notorious for with the Electrify Your Wife $50 campaign, as well as the Marlin lobster and turtle adverts, and the John Cameron Swayze narrated torture test campaigns, and the use of famous sports persons at the time with the infamous slogan, "I don't think I need to repeat." Now, another key aspect of Timex innovation outside the watches and the use of advertising was the distribution channels, moving beyond jewellers to tobacconists, newsstands, newsagents and such. This was not appreciated by many of their competitors. Continuing my excuse for bringing one of my favourite brands, Lip, Fred Lip famously disparaged the Timex-acquired Kelton brands, also based in Besançon in France from 1966, as being junk in the name of a watch, and was sued for suggesting in adverts that their watches should end up in the waste paper basket. The United States Time Corporation, which would become Timex Corporation in 1969, was omnipresent, especially within the US, with even Martin Luther King in 1968 wearing a Timex, as you can see on screen when he wasn't wearing his Rolex. Now I'm about to slow down and double click a bit more as we are reaching the era of Timex and the core topic of this video, which is their digital watch history and range from the 70s onwards, but let's take the excuse to flip through a few fun looking mechanicals, sourced from the websites of some collectors that you can see in the references. These include this 1968 Super Thin, this cool Blackjack Sprite, as well as the Roulette Sprite models from 1971, this Solar System dial model from 1974, this mid-1970s telephone style dial watch, and the pattern on this funky Dynabeat dial from 1977. Promotional models like this one from the US Olympic team at the 76 Olympics, and this limited edition watch to commemorate the achievements of the Brazilian Formula 1 driver Emerson Fittipaldi. You can see that Todd Snyder was still having some fun with the Timex back catalogue with some of his reissues, and he continues in this collaboration in reviving some of these old models. Right, quartz. I believe their first quartz model was the M62 movement, based on a patent granted in Germany in 1972, with the quartz resonator on one side and the electronics, supplied by RCA Labs, Hughes, the company owned by the guy that Leonardo DiCaprio plays, and Microma that made the Blade Runner watch. Apparently it was the first watch with an adjustable resistor for timing, whatever that means. Now the license for using Seiko technology for the stepping motor in quartz movements was very costly at the time, so Timex had to develop their own version made in Europe at the Besançon and Pforzheim, collaborating with Portiscap in Switzerland that had links to Besançon through their owner. These would be marketed under the Time Machine brand, which would be continued with the M63, 64 and 66 movements between 1972 and 1980. We're about to move into the meat of the video now, which is digitals, but first I'm running that experiment I mentioned, and I'm going to see whether providing a picture of a cute dog asking you to subscribe will make a difference. New strategy. With that experiment done, let's look at Timex digital watches in the 70s. Largely assembled by Timex after having sourced the most affordable parts elsewhere, the first wave of digital LCD watches started around 1974 to 75, around the same time Casio was launching the Casiotron. So latecomers versus the likes of Seiko, Orient and Texas Instruments, these would be the solid-state quartz models, or SSQ, and you can still find many of these around on eBay. This catalogue provides an idea of the range at the time under what they were calling Marathon LCD. I've seen it mentioned that these World Tams may be from 1979 or so, but I'm not 100% certain on that. They did also make LED watches that are collector's items now, 3 men and 1 ladies. It doesn't sound like these did too well at the time, with over half being returned due to quality issues. Being more followers in the digital space rather than leaders, Timex did similar versions to Casio, Seiko and Texas Instruments models as we move into the 80s, with this basic model from Cheap Old Watches Instagram account, this Alarm chronograph model from the Timex Vintage MX Instagram account, their pseudo-analog M433 from 1982, which was recently reissued, the M455 Melody Alarm, and this Dress Digital watch, the M417, as well as this 1982 Timex Calculator watch, with their later versions I've just dumped here for the moment for those calculator watch fans. Now Timex had perhaps been getting distracted with their short-lived foray into computers with the Timex Sinclair, bringing British computing technology to the US market, aiming to be an affordable option. Timex were ultimately squashed by the superior Commodore and struggled to compete with other platforms at the same price range and better specs. Of course, Sinclair themselves had a go at watches in the 70s with the Sinclair Black Watch, as would Commodore, but they didn't stay in the market for long, with the Japan and increasingly Chinese entrants squeezing the margins to really thin levels with their efficient production. For Casio, they managed to stay in the game by retaining value. For the G-SOC series starting in 1983, you could see that they were differentiating themselves, as well as their extraordinary innovation with things like the touch sensor. But for Timex, their saviour in the digital space would start out in 1984 as the Triathlon, a watch able to store 8 intermediate lap times. Fred Olsen has actually stated in interviews that he was the driver behind the move to running-based watches, and there's also the story of Mario Sabatini, a marketeer from Timex watches, taking initial triathlon models down to the Hawaii Triathlon in 1984 and selling out all the watches to the runners there. In 85-86, the beginning of the Ironman event in Hawaii would mark the collaboration where the triathlon would be rebranded as the Timex Ironman Triathlon, with water resistance boosted to 100 metres from 50 metres, and a true legendary watch was born. As this model with the green bezel says light rather than indigo, I think it might be one of the 80s Ironman models. Realising they were getting distracted by some of those other adventures, such as the Sinclair situation, and after the successes of the triathlon and the Ironman, Timex would double down from 1985 and very much focus on watches. In 1986, the next big hit would come out, complete with an epic ad at the Super Bowl, which was the Atlantis 100. It might be coincidence, but my hypothesis is that Fred Olsen had a big hand in this, as apparently the lost city of Atlantis was a common topic for him to amuse employees with, along with other subjects of a similar nature, which they called visiting the moon. It seems to be a recurring theme for their business, as I note that there's a spa on one of his cruises, also called the Atlantis. Also the subject matter of one of my fave games of all time, LucasArts point-and-click Fate of Atlantis. This really big hit is still around today, branded under the Expedition brand in some regions, and here is my reissue from Beams with this funky colour, with many other random colourways that have been out over the years. A lesser known venture is the Timex Marlin Digital in 1989. I get there we're going with the tagline here, but I think it is a bit of a strange sentiment. The Marathon 10 is still within the realms of watches that you may have heard of from the Timex brand, with a few variants, and you can see similar design motifs on this more basic 1989 model. However, now for some really crazy ones. First, the absolutely mad looking Skiathlom, watch designed for skiers with temperature indicator. Second, the Velo Track cycling watch with an odometer for measuring distance travelled and cadence. Third, the Wave Rider, complete with a so-called Zoe bug strap to store your lip balm, I believe. Fourth, the Hooks brand, which I think may have also been called the Blazer in some places, and from what I can see this is for fishing and outdoors navigation. Fifth, the Victory sailing watch, complete with TAC ratio computer and low-high tide indicator for the yachting brigade that I think Fred Olsen would obviously know well. Sixth, the Tri-Pre watch, set at a slight angle so you can see when you're driving your bike. Finally, from this batch, the Brave Wave. All pretty mad, but not at the levels of some of the Casio stuff I've covered from that era, and Casio were taking big share away this time. Before moving into the 90s, here are a few more basic models that I think are from the 80s. Right, let's get into the 90s. Timex's secret weapon, starting in 1992, was of course Indiglo, so named due to its bluish hue and its glowing facility, vastly superior to the small LED bulbs of the Casios of the time. This patent is from 1988, and it actually relates to analog watches, so I'm not sure what the deal is regarding digitals. Also note the name of a certain Norwegian, Fred Olsen. He didn't want to miss out on that IP. But it was the use of electroluminescence rather than LED bulbs, which is exciting a zinc sulfide layer which releases energy in the forms of light or photons rather than in the form of heat. I've gone over this in detail in another video on the history of the digital watch. It's a total rabbit hole. But boy, did they make no secret of their superiority on this in their commercials. In 1993, the public awareness of the watch would be boosted with its wearing by President Bill Clinton. Notably, Timex had a factory in Little Rock, the site which was actually now part of the Bill and Hillary Clinton Airport, with Little Rock being his home as governor of Arkansas. In 1996, we would introduce the all-day Indiglo, which is a reflective effect on the LCD screen that makes it appear to be glowing at all times. And whilst I'm at it, I just wanted to mention the so-called Timex Flicks technology, which is essentially their version of an auto-EL backlight, where the backlight turns on when you flick your wrist. Here's a version of it on a more modern Ironman. The 90s included some big deals between Timex and other technology, important licenses, and fashion organisations. On the technology side, in 1994, Timex did a deal with Microsoft on data link watches, which was an evolution to the Ironman that enabled the transfer of data by infrared beam to Microsoft computers. Cool fact is that on the strap, written in ASCII 24, it says, "Listen to the light if you can see." I presume an allusion to the transfer by infrared light, but sounds to me like some kind of literary quote, perhaps a password for Atlantis. This first model would be worn in space on the STS-88 by astronaut James Newman, and it has a whole bunch of space heritage. Talking of space, I'll chuck in these Timex Star Trek watches from the next generation, I believe from 1993, although the date of the middle one I'm not sure, including a Klingon watch complete with labels written in Klingon. But back to the data link. There were versions with a notebook adapter for laptops which would be released in 1997 for so-called road warriors needing to transfer data while on the move, and here is a complete set of all of the different data links, so clearly it's a big rabbit hole that I can't fully go down into here. Something very cool that I'm not sure Casio did was a collaboration with Motorola and Skytel to release Beepware, which was a watch with integrated pager in 1998. Regarding brands, a super cool digital watch was released with a license for Humvee, the military vehicles agreed with AM General. The Expedition brand, I believe, was launched in 1997. And another more obscure line, to my knowledge anyway, was the Zulu watches, I believe around 1993, according to a thread on this that I saw on Reddit r Watch Exchange. A line I've struggled to date, so leave in the comments if you know, I think it's around 2000, is the Reef Gear temperature sensor watches. Totally out of chronology, but I think that this Reef Gear series also got the so-called eye control functionality, I think in 2007, which enabled you to control your iPod from your watch. Timex started to make a big move into the more fashion-focused market in the 90s too, possibly not to the benefit of its watchmaking credentials, although it is understandable due to it being a very tough time with a reduction in demand for traditional watches. The first move was a company called Callanan in 1991, who were behind Guess watches and the Guess collection of watches. Here are some random digitals from them that are a bit more contemporary. With Nautica in 1994, not too many digitals, I only found this one. Opex in 2000, the French ladies fashion brand. And in 2005, Vertime, who owned the Versace watch license. This is the only digital watch of theirs that I could find, which is from their sub-brand Versus. I think now is as good a time as any to explore what has been my best effort to understand the current structure of the company and to sweep up a few remaining lines of watch and technology. Now, Fred Olsen and his daughter Annette Olsen are the key individuals at the top of the tree in the parent Fred Olsen Group that splits its activities between the largely energy-focused business, there's lots of random stuff in there, as well as the Timex Group, which is head up by Tobias Rees-Schmidt. As well as some of the stuff we like that has all the horological heritage originating from Waterbury, we do have to say that there's a whole load of questionable fashion stuff in there, and they're still making deals for more brands, including things like the recent Adidas deal and Judith Lieber brands, although thankfully a lot of this is split into business units such as Sequel that look after the Guess and Guess collection brands, and the luxury division that look after the deals with the big fashion brands like Versace, which are apparently made in Switzerland. As I've said, powerhouse of manufacturing is in the Philippines, with the design effort being led by Giorgio Galli Labs. Outside of the fashion market though, it's clear that Timex is back, targeting the watch enthusiast, and it's been said as such in recent interviews with the CEO. This includes initiatives such as their Made in America watch, and their reintroduction of mechanical watches, granted using Chinese seagull movements, but still mechanical watches. But what about digitals? Well, they do have a current range, and there are some fun ones, as well as, it must be said, a few uninspiring ones, but let's brass through this with quantity over quality perhaps. Ironman is still going strong with the classic 30, 50, 100 lap models, the sleek range, essential range and smartwatches, with the marathon series also still going. And there are periodically re-releases of the original in crazy colourwise. This is a small sample. The Expedition range includes what was the Atlantis, as well as a bunch of other more rugged-looking outdoorsy watches. The Command series, the Timex answer to the G-Shock, I believe, particularly like the urban one with the metal bracelet and marked with the world times there on the right. The DGTL range is primarily focused on anodigi and toughness, but there are weirdly some purely digital options in this range as well. And Timex have really hit onto something with the retro T80 range, a homage to similar watches from the 80s, which really capture the arcade-style vibe and colour schemes of the era. This has been the basis for quite a few collaborations recently, including Pac-Man, Coca-Cola, amongst others. Other super hype-beast versions include the Beams Tortoiseshell, Supreme, YMC clothing brand collaborations, as well as others you can see on screen. In summary, Timex more generally, but especially in my focus of their digital catalogue, is a bit of a confusing thing. It's a little lost in the plethora of different companies and brands, definitely a bit lost in fashion land, but has some awesome heritage in horology, electronics, social and pop culture history, and some periodic big hits, as well as their moves back into the mechanical and more watch enthusiastic centric areas of quartz, like the cool Timex Expedition North series that I'm looking forward to seeing. I'd like to see them offer the same sort of innovation and quality offerings we see from Casio, still with the G-Shock digital watches. Hopefully this video has at least helped pull out some of the interesting bits from their catalogue from a slight fog of blander offerings. And that's it for today's video on the Illuminating Watches channel. If you've enjoyed, please do like and subscribe and follow me over on Instagram. I'd love to hear below around your views on Timex watches, digital and otherwise. I respond to most comments, and please do consider checking out my other videos on related topics. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and here's a subscribe dog again, please do subscribe. Thank you and have a good one.